I'm Tim Barton.
And I'm Jonathan Ritchie.
And we're here at the American Journey Experience, where we are housing a combination of some really amazing artifacts. We have about 160,000 items and artifacts from American history, and it really is one of the largest collections in the world.
In fact, we have things that go all the way back to a oil lamp out of King David's palace from the biblical times, to things that even went to the moon, and we use those to tell the true story about America's history, looking at things from original documents and finding out what actually happened in America's past.
You know, Jonathan, as we look at culture today, one of the things that seems to be lost is the ability for people to go back and learn the real story from original documents. So often now people are looking online, they're doing some basic searches, or they've heard a professor say something. And there's so much of the narrative today that is a critical depiction of American history, which, if it was true, it would be acceptable because you accept the truth. But what's happening today is there's a literal rewriting of American history in spite of original documents and artifacts, and maybe just rejecting those documents and artifacts to tell a story that's more politically motivated than it is historically honest.
Absolutely, and I think there's so many voices nowadays. You mentioned, right, people just go on Google, and how often do they ever go to the second page of Google, right? They just take whatever is kind of first presented to them. That's why we've spent so many years collecting these original artifacts, because then we can actually present them with the honest truth, right? Because then it's not your word, it's not some professor's word, it's literally what happened, and we have things from that time. And we can look at almost every single aspect of America's history, from going all the way back to the original discovery by Christopher Columbus to the American founding to even things more recently, and we can see kind of a different story is being told than what actually happened.
So what we want to do is we want to go on a journey through American history. And as we do this, we're going to use original documents and artifacts. And so, as we mentioned, Christopher Columbus is kind of where most people know the story of America, where it begins. So let's back up to Christopher Columbus. What most people know from Christopher Columbus is that in 1492,
Columbus sailed the ocean blue, right?
And that's probably what most people remember or learned along the way. And the reality is there's so much more to the story of Columbus that today very few people know the actual story of Columbus. For example, Columbus had more than one voyage to America, which is shocking for most people to discover, but the reality is he had 4 voyages, and those voyages were very different. And today, in modern culture, there's a lot of people very critical of Christopher Columbus. In fact, over the last couple of years, when there was a movement to tear down statues, Christopher Columbus had over 600 statues erected to him around the world, and the vast majority of those statues were torn down, were vandalized, because people now view Christopher Columbus as a bad, evil person. But it's worth asking the question, if he was bad, was he bad on the first, second, third, or fourth voyage? And the reason that matters is, if you don't know the story of the voyages, how do you know he even was bad in the first place?
Yeah, and it's as you go back, you see this isn't necessarily even the first time that people have started attacking historical figures. And what I have here is actually a volume out of Washington Irving's 3-volume Life of Columbus. This was done in 1828, and it was really one of the first serious historical inquiries into who Columbus was, what he did, why he's important and significant. And Washington Irving actually highlights this spirit of kind of tearing down monuments that we see so often today, and he highlights it in a very significant way, and I'd like to read you what he says. He says, "There is a certain meddlesome spirit which, in the garb of learned research, goes prying about the traces of history, casting down its monuments, and marring and mutilating its fairest trophies. Care should be taken to vindicate great names from such pernicious erudition. It defeats one of the most salutary purposes of history, that of furnishing examples of what human genius and laudable enterprise may accomplish." And it's, I mean, even though this was written back in 1828, it almost sounds like it was written last year, because every single Columbus Day, which comes around every year, more places, more cities, states, and jurisdictions are saying, no, let's not celebrate Columbus Day, let's do something else. People say maybe something like Indigenous Peoples Day, but they're really tearing down these monuments of Columbus without even knowing what Columbus even did.
Right, and so let's go through this, because some of the accusations we hear today is, right, Columbus, the genocide of the Native Americans, the enslavement of the Native Americans. You hear a lot of negative things today, so let's just back up. Let's walk through this first voyage, and even why was Columbus going in this sailing expedition in the first place? Because if he's really looking for a trade route to India, right, there's other options, except at that time there were some issues with the trade routes.
Yeah, well, during this time, Columbus is kind of growing up in Spain. Spain itself is still trying to reconquer itself after some of the Muslim jihads in the medieval period, which conquered all of North Africa, had invaded Spain, had almost gotten up to France, but they had really shut off the overland trade routes to get to India. And so people in the West, such as Columbus and the rulers of Spain and Portugal and England, were starting to look at different options of how do we get to India, how do we get to the spices, the goods, the trade routes there without going over land. And so some people like the Portuguese started sailing down the African coast trying to figure out, okay, can we even get around Africa? Because they didn't know even where Africa ended at that point. And Columbus starts reading the old histories and science books from going back to the ancient Greeks and the Romans and early scientists, and he starts to develop this idea of, I think we can just sail that way across the Atlantic and we'll eventually reach India.
The idea that the Earth was a globe, he didn't know the scale, right? He was a little off on the size, but the idea that this is a round ball, let's just sail around it and it might be a lot better. And so, like even today, he gets credit for discovering America. Technically, he didn't really discover America, and if we're really honest and kind of go back officially, there were Vikings. There were other people who had landed on mainland North America. Obviously, there were Native Americans here, so Columbus was not the first guy, but as far as the Western world was concerned, nobody had really done what he did, and then to come back with the stories he had. So let's walk through that. So Columbus goes on this journey across the ocean and discovers some islands.
Yeah, so he gets there, and this he thinks is India, but obviously he's a little bit mistaken because he's run into North, Central, and South America, which really nobody knew was even there on the map. And so he gets there and he starts to explore, goes from island to island, and he runs into some of the natives there, which are known as the Taino or Taino tribe. They're part of the Arawak language group, and you can kind of find out a lot more about those. There's a lot of rich history, but he finds them and begins to try to communicate with them. He had actually brought guys who, knew various language, Arabic, a whole bunch of different things, hopefully to be able to communicate with the people that he found there. And so he starts this process of really the old world and the new world coming together. It's one of the most significant moments in world history where all of a sudden you have these, Spaniards, and Columbus himself is an Italian, but he's leading Spanish ships, and they discover this world that had been untouched by outside society for hundreds, if not thousands of years, and trying to navigate that, not necessarily conflict, but that
Clash
meeting of cultures,
yeah.
Right?
And this is where also it's interesting, as you noted, he was an Italian selling for a Spanish nation because they're the ones who funded him, right? Ferdinand and Isabella funded him. We actually have a pretty cool document going back when Columbus first sailed. It was 1492. This is a legal document from King Ferdinand, Queen Isabella from 1493. So this is literally the era of Columbus sailing the ocean blue on this first voyage. This is an official governing document from Spain.
Yeah, you can actually see the signatures of King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella right here and here. So this is Lorraine, the king, Lorena, the queen. And so this is a really cool document from that period where Columbus is leaving from Spain. And Columbus was actually kind of good friends with Queen Isabella. They were known as the Catholic monarchs because they had finally reconquered all of the Iberian Peninsula, pushing back the Muslims who had obviously invaded earlier. And they were very significant figures in the world at that point when they decided to equip Columbus with 3 ships, right? The Nina, Pinta, Santa Maria, and then let Columbus kind of sail off into the Atlantic Ocean, attempting to do what really very few, basically nobody had ever done before. And then what makes Columbus stand out from even some of those Vikings is that he comes back and he publishes it, right? He spreads the word, and then he's able to bring people back and actually accomplish the voyage not just the second time, but a third time and a fourth time as well.
So after he has 3 ships, Nina, Pinta, Santa Maria, they discover the islands. Interestingly enough, he doesn't return with 3 ships. There's obviously some stories surrounding that with maybe who was supposed to be on watch and who didn't take care. And so one of the ships ends up getting grounded. And so they're not able to return. Now, at this point, they've made contact with Taino. Interesting, there's a letter from Columbus back to the Queen and King where he acknowledges that this Taino tribe, they're a really impressive people.
Yeah, and actually, he publishes a letter once he gets back, but in his journals he talks about specifically what type of a culture he's encountered with the Taino. And what's fascinating is, obviously, there are so many of the professors and people today who say Columbus is just this evil, white, racist guy. But in his journal, as he is explaining and kind of documenting what all he has seen, he explicitly looks at the Taino, their culture, their customs, and how they are, because you mentioned earlier, one of his ships actually runs aground. It's the Santa Maria, his flagship. The Indian tribe that he had met and kind of become friends with actually sail out to Columbus's ship on their canoes. They pick up all of the Spaniards who are, kind of floating around in the ocean. They get all of their things. They help them get to land. And Columbus writes in his diary that day, kind of to the king and queen, and he says, "Your Highnesses should feel great joy, because presently they," talking about the natives, "will be Christians and instructed in the good manners of your realm. For a better people," or race is actually the word he uses there, "for a better race there cannot be on earth. And both people and land are in such quantity that I do not know how to write it." So,
yeah, let's stop there for a second. The fact that he says a better race or a better people there cannot be, that's already super interesting with these notions that Columbus was this racist, genocidal monster. You don't see that at all from this first interaction. But as the story unfolds, because now they only have 2 ships, not all the crew can fit on 2 ships, and so they have to leave some of their crew behind. As you mentioned, the Taino, the Taino, they actually came out to try to help rescue the men, get them in. And so when Columbus has to leave men behind, the Taino help them find a location, and they build a little fort. And Columbus tells the men, right, hey, we're not going to forget you. We're going to go back, we'll kind of report what we've discovered, and then we're going to come back and find you. But in the midst of this, the Taino somewhere along the way informed Columbus that we're not the only tribe on this island.
That's right. The Taino tell Columbus that there's another tribe, actually, that's very warlike, and comes and raids their villages, steals their men, steals their women, and they're actually cannibals, and eat the people that they capture and enslave the people who they don't eat and take them back to their villages. And Columbus, at this point, right, he's kind of skeptical. He's like, I don't know about that, guys. It's 1492. People don't eat people anymore. That's way back in antiquity, right? The Greeks and the Romans had myths about people doing that. But we're in a civilized world in 1492. People don't do that anymore. And so they leave and go back to Spain and announce the voyage. Columbus and his, sailors are hailed as heroes, and immediately work begins to equip the second voyage to go back. And this one is not a voyage of discovery, but it's a voyage of, kind of colonization. They're going to bring more people there, they're going to establish trade posts, and they're going to continue to try to find the mainland, because Columbus had only encountered islands, and he's like, we got to get to India proper and establish those trade routes. And so they go back with a much more substantial fleet this time around, and like you said, he wasn't going to forget the men that he left there the first time, and they go back to where they had left the men, but they don't find the men there, technically.
I mean, at least not alive, right?
Yeah.
Because when they land, they do realize that the fort that was left behind has been destroyed, and they do begin to find bodies. And the bodies they find have been cannibalized on some level, which, again, consider where we are today, right? Where Columbus thought he was in 1492, like, that's just not something you expect to see. Finding a human body that's missing things because somebody's come and cannibalized part of that body, and this is what he discovers. So you can imagine the frustration, the outrage of what in the world is going on right now. Somebody just ate my people. So he finds the Taino, and like, guys, what's going on? You can imagine they're like, we tried to tell you, like, we warned you about this. And so this actually, on some level, seems to cement a level of friendship and connection with the Taino, because they join forces together on some level to say, okay, now, like, that enemy is our enemy too. Right? The Taino told them, the Caribbees, the Caribs, they're not nice people, which is also where the word Caribbean comes from, so interesting connection. They were also known as the Canib tribe, which is the root of the word cannibal, so some interesting connections with us along the way. But as this unfolds, then at that point, Columbus and his men, they're ready to go to war on some level, because they want to defend the honor of the people, the men they left behind that not only were killed, but were eaten on some level.
Yeah, and then also, too, the Taino tribe actually asks Columbus to join into a coalition force to go with them, because the Caribs had attacked that tribe, too, and actually had stolen one of the king's wives, had killed another one of his wives, and so they asked Columbus to go with them, and so they sail out, they find the Carib tribe, and they actually defeat them in battle. And this is where one of the big kind of accusations against Columbus kind of comes from, because Columbus, after defeating them in battle, enslaves some of them and actually sends them back to Spain. And people say, this, right, Columbus is this terrible guy, he's just a slave trader and things of that nature, but you have to contextualize it in the wider period, right? Because it was after a war, after they had been attacked.
In the 1400s.
In the 1400s, right? There's only so many options you have at that point.
I think there's probably two.
Some would argue for a third. The Caribs would argue for a third.
Yeah, so generally, most cultures would say, right, if you just conquered a people group and they're survivors, the two options are you could kill or you could enslave the people you would just conquer. Now, as you're alluding to, maybe the Caribs are like, third option, we can eat them. That's a kind of frowned on more, I guess, in polite society on some level. But this was the reality when people look back and go, but Columbus enslaved the natives. The only natives that Columbus ever approved of enslaving were those that he had fought in a justified war like this scenario, where his men had been attacked, they had been eaten. And so Columbus at this point, you would say historically, totally justified in defending the honor of his men who had been killed and eaten, and at this point even going with his allies, other Native Americans, because this isn't just Columbus turning on the natives. Columbus is actually with a native tribe in the midst of this war against another native tribe. And even as you're mentioning, looking at the greater context, it's worth noting that the Caribs were a pretty well, on some level, well-documented people group in some of the atrocities of what they did.
Yeah, actually, after this kind of happens, obviously Columbus continues exploring because that's who he is. He's an explorer. And we have a lot of letters from the people who went with Columbus. And they, are journaling. They're writing down what they're seeing. I mean, this would be like if you and I went to, another planet, right? Everybody's going to be writing down what they saw in their experiences. And so in one of the accounts from his crewmen, they note, and they're talking about kind of the practices of the Caribs, specifically about how they wage war on the other Indians. And this sailor says, in this manner, they, talking about the Caribs, sail to the neighboring islands, making their way by paddling to people who differ greatly in manners and character. Sometimes they go greater distances, even as far as 1,000 miles in search of plunder. They customarily castrate their infant captives and boy slaves and fatten them like calves. The thin and emancipated are carefully nurtured like wethers. Soon, when plump and fat, they're devoured all the more avidly. They hand over the female captives as slaves to their womenfolk or make use of them to satisfy their desires. Children born by the captive women are eaten like the captives. I mean, this is horrific stuff that Columbus and the Spaniards are running into, and that the other natives who are there are having to deal with on a daily basis.
And this is something that it makes a lot more sense too. If you are in a scenario, you're seeing this firsthand, where you would go, okay, I'm not putting up with this anymore. On some level of righteousness, integrity, you're like, I'm warring against this because that is evil, and I'm standing up against evil. It's ironic today that looking at what Columbus was fighting against, that he's the one that gets accused of bad things, when the reality is, it was a pretty savage world he encountered on several levels. Now, again, not everybody was, because the Taino tribe, great tribe, right? He says a better people there couldn't be, but not everybody was the peaceful Native American. With that being said, this is part of his second voyage. The second voyage you mentioned was a voyage of colonization. There's 17 ships. There's 1,200 people that come. And Columbus even noted that some of the people that were in this voyage were not maybe the most honorable. They weren't the best representations of what would be considered a Christian culture in the Western world. So he's even a little skeptical for the king and queen of who's coming. But nonetheless, that's part of the second voyage. So this is the main encounter from the second voyage. He then goes back, and then we come up to the third and then the fourth voyage.
On the third voyage, Columbus comes back, and this time, instead of, dealing with issues from cannibals, he finds out that the Spanish who had come on the second voyage are in open revolt. They've been revolting. Basically, they said that, we don't like these Italian guys ruling over us, because it was Columbus and then his brothers who had kind of been installed as the governor and leaders of these new Spanish possessions in the New World. And they said, why should these Italians be telling us Spaniards what to do?
And let's also keep in context that the Spaniards who were coming weren't like missionary Spaniards, right?
No.
They weren't coming to witness and try to convert Native Americans to Christianity or Catholicism, whatever the case might be. They were people largely discovering there were opportunities for wealth, for gold along the way, which is also one of the things Columbus gets accused of stealing from the Native Americans. There is a really interesting letter from Columbus where he actually tells his men, tells the people he's in charge of, that you're not allowed to take anything from a Native American if you haven't exchanged something of value to them, to kind of give them an equal exchange, because the Native Americans largely did not have the same thought of gold for the Spaniards. All that to say, and I guess this is a letter that...
Well, yeah, I mean, it's actually the first kind of colonial policy Columbus institutes, is that you can't take anything from the natives unless you give them something of value in return. So, right, if they came with some gold dust, you know, you couldn't give them, like, you know, a little button off of your shirt. You had to give them something of value to them. And so Columbus institutes these policies to kind of protect the natives from the Spaniards. And this is what the Spaniards don't like. They don't like this restriction being put on them. They don't like being punished for doing what they wanted to do. And so this leads them to rebel against Columbus and his brothers. And this is kind of what he comes back to, Columbus does, when he journeys on the third voyage. And this just leads to a whole host of issues.
So, and remind me, when he comes on this third voyage, this is also where my recollection is that he discovers the Spaniards doing some pretty awful things, including enslaving Native Americans and the abuse and maybe even murder on occasion of some of these Native Americans. So Columbus, he shows up, and with a pretty strong hand, he puts a stop to it. But that strong hand is also what offended a lot of the Spaniards.
Yes, that's exactly right. And so the Spaniards actually send word back to Spain, and they start accusing Columbus of being this evil tyrant who's oppressing them, taking away their rights, and doing just all these, basically they accuse him of doing all the things that they were doing. So the king and queen hear this, and they're like, this is not good. We obviously need to send somebody to investigate. So they send somebody to act as kind of judge, jury, and not executioner, but kind of the guy with the total authority to do whatever needed to be done, right? Because this is, you know, over a month-long voyage, like it's literally another world, so he has to have the powers needed. So he shows up there, and the first thing he sees is actually several Spaniards who had been hanged for the crimes that they had committed against the Indians, and also in rebelling against, you know, the Spanish government in those islands. And so he sees this, and he says, this is unbelievable that Columbus, this Italian guy, would be doing this. He immediately puts Columbus and his brothers in chains and then ships them back to Spain to stand trial for all these accusations. He actually takes a lot of testimony from people who are there, and he only ever interviews the people who were rebelling against Columbus, and he sends all of this back with Columbus on that boat while they're in chains to go stand trial before the king and queen.
And it's worth noting that pretty much every accusation they had against Columbus are the accusations repeated today by people.
Yeah.
Columbus was Spaniard. All these things, but if you actually study the story of Columbus, Columbus was the one leading the end of those things in the islands that he was in charge of, saying, guys, we're not going to rape, we're not going to murder, we're not going to enslave people who've done nothing to us. And because of that opposition, and because then when people said, well, you can't stop us, and he was like, watch me, and he executes them, this is what led to so much of that revolt. But it's interesting and worth noting that when he gets back before the king and queen, and then he gets to tell the other side of the story, which is kind of a big deal in the due process, that you don't just have one side giving you information, that actually both sides get to present their side of the story. And when you hear all the information, then hopefully a good ruler will weigh the evidence and make a good decision. And Columbus was exonerated of every charge against him once he got to present his side of the story.
That's right. And so while the king and queen don't make him kind of governor of the Indies, as they were called at that time, again, they do clear him of all charges and kind of reinstitute him to his honorary titles of Admiral of the Ocean Sea, and they approve him to go back on a fourth and final voyage. In this voyage, Columbus is back to being the explorer that he was at the beginning. He actually winds up touching down in the mainland of Central America, but he runs into some problems. He actually gets shipwrecked for over a year, and it's not even because he couldn't get word to other people, because he did. He got word to kind of the Spanish colonies, and he was like, hey, I'm shipwrecked. If we could get some help, that'd be great. And the Spanish ignored Columbus's requests for aid because they still don't like him because of what he is and who he is. And so they ignore him, and then eventually he is able to get back to these colonies and then eventually make his way back to Spain. And this is in the early 1500s at this point.
So big picture looking at Columbus, right? With the 4 voyages, Columbus dealt with a lot of issues, a lot of significant details and context to the story of some of what happened that today a lot of people just don't know about. And it's something that we actually on the Wall Brothers website have several articles dealing with. We also have a book, The American Story, where we footnote everything we're talking about now. We have footnoted in The American Story, and there's a lot more to the story, but we hear other accusations. There's a lot of people today that say Columbus was in search of gold and he just wanted to profit himself. He had a lust for gold. And you actually read his writings, and he says, actually, to the king and queen, he writes them a letter and says, I want you to take all the gold from everything I discover and use it for the conquest to recapture Jerusalem, so that Jerusalem would once again be in the power of Catholics, be in the power of Christians, and it wouldn't be the Muslims from the Muslim Jihad that had it. So,
well, what's super interesting is Columbus, based on the kind of theological works that he was reading, thought that the second coming was right around the corner. It was around 100 years, 150 years away. And according to the way that they read the Bible at that point, they said, Christians have to be in Jerusalem for the second coming, and they had been kicked out by the Muslims during their holy wars, and so there had to be an effort to retake Jerusalem, and that's why Columbus wanted to reestablish the original trade routes with India to generate income in order to fund that kind of expedition to liberate Jerusalem.
So here's the reality. There's a lot more to the story than we hear most of the times. And we would even encourage, when you go back to original documents, the original documents are so much different than the modern narrative is in most occasions. It's something that we would encourage. Don't take somebody's word for it. You need to do the research for yourself. Go back to the original document. There's a lot of great resources out there at wallbuilders.com. You can get online, find some of these original resources. We also have a work called The American Story, where you can follow along with part of this narrative and you can see the footnotes for yourself. But we as a people have to stop trusting what somebody else tells us, and we have to do the research for ourselves. And I'm Tim Barton.
And I'm Jonathan Ritchie.
Thanks for joining us here on This Time with the American Journey.